thank you for taking time out of your day to come and join us.
Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate being here.
Thank you. Saffron, Agrana Fruit is a company which is an Austrian-owned industrial processing company.
Correct.
What does that mean in layman's terms?
Yeah, it's a lot, isn't it? So industry is basically the main processor of, I would say, fruit ingredients going into a finished product. So we work with businesses, and basically the consumer has a finished product with a brand.
Excellent. So I suppose the relevance for us today is for anybody within the horticulture industry who's growing fruit and some other products. They could look at Agrana as another revenue stream, perhaps as a processing option rather than just the fresh fruit market.
Definitely, and I think this is probably one of the interesting reasons why we get to talk today. In being at the Mangoes Conference in Cairns, we actually realised that industry is not publicly spoken about in farming industries, and traditionally farming industries, regardless of Australia or globally, consider that the retail is their first option, and they forget that they do have a plan B or a plan C, or even a plan A in us. And we really got to expose, I guess, ourselves to the industry, but also to learn a lot from the industry in those conferences. So,
yeah, fabulous. So Agrana Fruit's been in Australia for 60-something years, I think you and I were having a chat about, but
Yep.
you've been overseas for many, many moons before
Correct.
that. We know that the social compliance landscape within Australia is changing. What trends do you see as General Manager on that national and international landscape around that hort supply chain for your business?
Sure. Well, I think the industry is changing and obviously evolving, and technology is supporting how farmers are now getting to the markets, and obviously how they're looking after their farms. And sustainability and social compliance is obviously two of our key principles. So Agrana focuses on being a market leader, and being in a market leading position, you need to drive change. So we've been very vocal about driving sustainability change and also working with social compliance. But not just that, we actually work with science-based targets because we are governed by the EU. So all of our sustainable practices and social practices are actually measured, and the reporting is done independently, which gives us a lot more concrete evidence to what we're actually doing.
Yeah, right. I was doing some reading, and it seems that within the ESG framework for Agrana, that sustainability absolutely underpins everything. And I suppose when we talk about sustainability, we talk about the whole environmental impact. We also need to talk about the financial impact. And a business isn't sustainable unless it has some money, right? So,
Correct.
you know, there's a lot of bows in that aspect. So we know that sustainability is so important, and obviously consistency of supply for Agrana, so you can sustain your business to your customers.
Definitely.
How else do you see sustainability impacting on Australian horticulture?
I find it fascinating that a lot of people are talking sustainability and don't really have concrete understanding of what they're trying to achieve. And where Agrana comes into the picture with that, along with your organisation, is actually helping farmers to develop their practices. So we look at the farm, they can do a self-assessment, which allows them to talk about all of the highly educated areas that they're looking after and what they're focused on from a sustainability point of view. And then they can send that data in independently and receive benchmarking, which allows them to benchmark their farm not only locally but globally. Helps them to look at their sustainable practices, and in turn what we've found is farmers have saved a lot of money by actually doing this exercise.
Yeah, well, that's always good, isn't it? I think
is.
process improvement and bottom line improvement is a win-win.
It is, definitely.
So how does Agrana work with growers in a collaborative fashion to help them with that compliance aspect? Do you sort of nurture the growers through that process? How does Agrana tackle that one?
Definitely, and I think it is a nurture process, because there is so much legal frameworks around different parts of practicing and different social compliances that now farmers will move into, and it's a real education piece. So I think originally it was industry-based from a government body, but not necessarily at a farm level with farm language, and I think that's the kind of connection that we're making now with the Australian farmers and also with the overseas farmers.
Yeah, gosh. So do you see much of a difference? Is Australia leading the way, or is Australia behind the eight ball when it comes to this? on an international landscape, being an international company,
Yeah.
how do we fit in that marketplace?
Look, there's different legislations for every country, and obviously I would say Australia is incredibly hard to bring into the country.
Okay.
Maybe a little easier to get out of the country based on the fact that Australia's produce is considered, number one around the world. It is
Yeah.
obviously, especially tropical fruits in Australia. We have a very good market presence, and globally, Australian fruit produce is highly ranked. So. Looking at the competitive advantage that we have in Australia, I believe we're more agile, and therefore the farmers have more opportunity to have a point of difference. And in a local scale, they're not necessarily seeing it now, but from a global perspective, they will actually become market leaders if they're looking at the social practices now.
Yeah, so it's obviously something that needs to be embedded because it is a changing landscape. We know that this whole aspect of social compliance isn't going away anywhere at all.
No.
That businesses like yours that are international and play on that international playing field really are looking at ways in which that we can be competitive on that in that global space. So looking at that, and we know that supply issues, when I was talking to one of your colleagues, lots of the products that I see on our supermarket shelves say from 95% imported ingredients.
Sure.
Why is that when we've got so much fresh produce available in Australia? Is it we produce more than we can eat?
So Australia is not governed or, built up for an industry perspective like other countries are. So we value fresh fruit in Australia and fresh produce, and of course Australia has an abundance of that. And traditionally, nearly everything that's grown in Australia goes into the farm or into the retail market, and so therefore it has a home and finds its way to a consumer.
Yeah.
What we find overseas is that there's more fruit than goes to the consumer, and therefore there's a lot left over for industry. And because of that, therefore, they have a lot larger practices around working with industry. That's not to say one's better than the other, and I think really Australia has the opportunity to get into industry now, and that's why we're out here speaking and trying to get getting the farmers to understand that we can be a plan A for them or a plan B.
Yeah. So what might that look like in real terms? So if I were a mango grower or an apple grower or something like the strawberry grower, whatever commodity you'd like to choose, and I had a standard supply chain and I had agreements with my customers and that sort of stuff, but perhaps in dealing with some of the retail issues sometimes those loads might not be accepted, or my fruit might have made it to spec or whatever the case might be. Are you an option in a short term, or are you looking at sort of long-term relationship building? How could my fruit fulfill your needs in that instance?
I think it's twofold. So if you had a surplus of materials that didn't necessarily make it to the retail industry, and that was something that you were looking for a supply, it depends on whether you were looking to supply it under yourself or whether you were looking for your ingredients to be used. By contacting Agrana, you can actually allow us to facilitate a relationship between a customer and a product, or alternatively, which is, I believe, the best infrastructure, is to set up early. Talk to us early. Talk to us before your harvest. Let us understand that, is there a quantity? Could we connect you with the right processor to make sure that it comes from an industrial standards? And I think traditionally farmers have believed that industry will buy produce at a very economic price, because that's the industry standard.
It's a perception?
It's a perception. It's not reality. And I think that's probably the one that we would like to dispel the most.
Yeah.
Because reality is that we should be considered as part of your plan rather than a last resort to your crop.
So what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, is that potentially if I had some unproductive land and I could actually end up producing more, I could produce for my current customers and my current supply, but perhaps I could, if I wanted to increase my volumes, plant and harvest out further and then supply into you as an additional diversity and protection of my revenue streams.
Definitely, and having those early discussions with us allows us to help you in that process, and I think that's what we want to add value to. Whether you choose to come to Agrana or whether you choose to go to a competitor, it's not a concern for us. It's more about making sure that you understand you have choices and letting us help you to understand what those choices are.
I think that's a really key statement that you've made there, because I know that a lot of growers often feel that they're over a barrel. You know, we know that there's been a whole lot that's gone on with supermarket inquiries, and there's been some pricing pressures and all that sort of stuff, rising input costs, margin squeeze, the whole shebang. But I suppose really if there was a consistency and if a value add for that produce was certainly an option, to be able to say, look, this is going to be my fixed revenue that I'm going to be guaranteed coming through, and the rest of it, you know, can go to a fresh market, then maybe that's a business model that some businesses could potentially look at.
Definitely, and industry should be considered part of your revenue stream, regardless, again, whether it's local or whether it's internationally. We have the ability from an industry perspective to give you something different to the retail, and I know that there's a lot of concern with the retailers at the moment. That's not the area of discussion for us, but it's more, I would say the retailers have done an amazing opportunity for Australian farmers and actually getting brands and references actually out to the market and to the consumer's mindset. So I think retail have done a brilliant job. But in relation to revenue streams, I think farmers should just know that they have those options and discuss with industry bodies. So there was a couple of other industry bodies that were presented at the last conference that help farmers to understand that there is options and that it's their choice.
Yeah. So going back and linking this back to that social compliance, if I were a grower coming to you, would you be asking me, am I part of a program? Would it be mandated that I prove to you what my employment and my labour practices are like on farm to be able to do business with you on that international level?
Definitely. So we do have obviously our own governance and environmental and social impacts that we look to follow. And again, being governed by EU, we have very strict guidelines. But we don't say that's a limiting factor. What we say is if you aren't qualified, then there are industry bodies and of course ourselves that can help you get there. So having that discussion early allows you to maybe prepare your farm or prepare your infrastructure to be ready for having both revenue streams, retail and industry.
Interesting. So when working with growers to help build that capacity, is there a team that you work with who sort of are on the ground that can look and guide some growers as to what it is that they need to do to meet those requirements?
Yes, we have an amazing sustainability team and they are in our Vienna head office, so but fully engaged with farmers all around the world. We also have an Agrana toolbox, and the toolbox is basically a kit. So a farmer can come to us, or an industry could come to us and say, hey, I have these kind of produce, this is what I'm looking for, and then we can customise what they need from an information point of view, very much like your organisation, because we're tailoring it in a language that allows them to only develop to the point that they want to. We're not saying you have to go to the highest level. The highest level will generate more revenue and offer you a premium product in the market, but some farmers can't get there. So there's levels in which they can acquire in order to be able to go to industry. But from a social compliance, that's the number one rule. And industry, retailers and industry are driving social compliance, and I would assume that most farmers would want to come on the journey.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We think that, the intent is to do good, and sometimes mistakes are made, and we get that, and that's not a problem. But really, I suppose a social compliance framework helps the business demonstrate and have evidence, and that's what audits do, and that's what all of your documentation does. Provide that you can evidence that you're actually doing the right thing, which, as we know, is a massive requirement within the fresh produce space, and obviously within the industrial product space as well. So as a grower, from that perspective, if I didn't have a social compliance platform or a program, would Agrana be sort of then saying, anybody contact an organisation like Fair Farms, we need you to be housed in that kind of ecosystem to start the ball rolling, to do the self-assessment, to do the online assessment?
Yes, well, I mean, traditionally from an international perspective, Agrana work with SEDEX, and SEDEX compliance is obviously a global standard. But from an Australian perspective, I think that there are opportunities and are choices for farmers. So your organisation, but there are a few others as well. And it's really up to how much the farmer would like to engage as to where we would direct that communication. But it doesn't have to be a one-way conversation. So if they're calling me, I'd probably call you. So it will be an ecosystem that we will create by talking about the fact that industry is here and that farmers have choice.
Yeah, that's great, because I think that's one thing that people want to feel, that they're not left over a barrel with nowhere to go.
Of course.
And that, that we're looking at important options.
And I think that's a really an important point. There is no barrel in the sense that you can get there, it just may take you longer. So it's taking the steps that work for your farm and for your environment and obviously for your area.
Yeah, that's right. So Saffron, we spoke about beforehand that it could be either a plan A or a plan B or a plan C, and don't make us the plan C, have the conversations up front. I suppose one thing that we know that growers are most sensitive about is not being able to get a premium price. So when a product does go to an industrial processor, for example, could we consider that it might be on par with what the fresh produce market might be paying in that respect?
Yeah, so the only difference is really that we buy by the kilo and retail by the product.
Yeah.
So again, you shouldn't be disadvantaged by picking a different revenue stream, but I can't give you a guarantee.
No.
It's not the way that it works. However, our job is to make sure that the farms get a fair price for the product that we're promoting. And our customers and our consumers want that as well. So I think, there are some really amazing campaigns out at the moment in making sure that social compliance from a farming perspective is not just for the workers, it's actually for the farmers, and making sure that the farmers feel comfortable in the environment that they're in. So there's avenues that we can create for that.
Yeah, so really what I'm hearing is that social compliance framework does provide market access to the domestic market within your space, as well as to the international markets as well that you're supplying with product.
Yeah.
Because, when we are on a global scale, and we are nowadays, business is international.
Correct.
We've got a certain level that we all have an expectation that businesses will meet when doing business with each other in a global landscape. For businesses who are wanting to gain market access, do you see that there is potentially a higher value paid on that product than those, or is there a value in social compliance, and is that reflected in the price? I suppose that's what I'd like to know.
I think if there isn't, there should be, but I'm not 100% sure it's value versus social compliance. I feel the industry
That's a
will
good
take...
argument. Sorry, it is. It can't just be one or the other. It's got to be a combination, isn't it?
I believe
there's
so.
value in social compliance.
Exactly, but the industry, and I don't mean the industry as in us, I mean retail industry and consumer industry is actually driving social compliance.
Yeah.
But where I see the biggest impact for Australian farmers in particular is that we have a skilled shortage, and we have a skilled shortage for the farmers. If we're not bringing in social compliance, how are we encouraging more people to come and pick fruit? It's that circle of life that we have to create for our industry. And the social compliance is not just focused on the welfare of the individual, it's focused on the welfare of the organisation. And I think the resources that the farmers get to actually look after their workers but look after themselves is critical.
Yeah, that's right. It's got to be a win-win situation all around. Often a lot of businesses will feel that it's all about the employees, but if it can help generate better business practices,
Exactly.
drive efficiency and increase profits, then that's exactly what the business owner wants to be able to achieve. Pardon me. So from your side of things, how much does social compliance play in an international space? We know that, is Australia leading the way? Is Australia behind the game? Where do we sit on that playing field from a Grana's perspective?
I think Australia is definitely second fiddle to international, but that's only because social compliance was driven more from an international point of view.
Right, so we've got some catching up to do,
We've got
is
some
that
catching
right?
up to do, but we've got some catching up to do only because we started later in the game, and that's because traditionally everything was produced within Australia, and so therefore we had the ability to keep the ecosystem tight. Farmers knew that their produce was going to retailers, retailers knew how to do the traceability right back to the farm, consumers felt confident with the product. And in a fresh form, that works, but in a processed form from industry, internationally they're far more advanced in that space because their farms are governed by a lot more regulations than we have here in Australia.
Yeah, sure. And looking at it from an environmental impact, and when we talk about if there's product that's produced in Australia and it's then exported overseas,
Sure.
what sort of percentage of that would that look like in your business?
So from Agrana Australia, we service Southeast Asia, New Zealand and Australian markets. So we have quite a large scope, but internationally we have 29 factories around the world.
Oh my gosh.
And we service multiple countries. So pretty much anywhere within the world that you attend or that you go, Agrana will be present in some form.
Yeah.
And we are very focused on obviously looking after our compliance, and that's our guidelines from social, environmental, and also looking at technology and advancement. So we are in a position that we should be driving change, but driving change that has impact for a consumer.
Yeah, and do you think that that's influenced by consumer expectation? Are consumers the one who are perhaps lifting the bar with the product purchases and they're voting with their dollars in that respect to go with more ethically sourced products? Is that what that translates to?
I'm not sure that a consumer is going down to an ethical level. I'm not sure. However, I believe COVID definitely increased consumer awareness about brands, consumer awareness in relation to social compliance. Consumers are engaging with brands now because of what they do socially, and that comes right back down to the farm. So you think about all of the new I guess retail had mandated things. In 2028, they're looking to have sustainably sourced materials into the supermarkets, sustainably sourced packaging. They're driving the change, and the retailers are driving it obviously because the consumers are driving it. So it is happening, and I feel that we're taking all of the best qualities of what's happened overseas, and we're actually being more agile in Australia. So we will get there quicker.
Oh, so we're responsive, you think?
I think we are. I genuinely believe we are from Australia, from my perspective and from the farmers that I engage with. They're so proactive and so engaged in doing better. And, you know, I would say from a global and international, local and international framework, everybody's engaged to do better. But I feel Australia has more of an ability to turn it quicker.
Yeah, well, that's comforting to know. In some respects, it's a little scary to think that there's just going to be more regulation mandated coming our way, but I suppose we kind of need to expect that if we have a look at what history's told us over the last few years and different pieces of legislation that have come in. It's only going to really create that path forwards.
Sure.
So some of those insights, I suppose, with what's happening in the international space, we need to anticipate that there's going to be that expectation that Australia will follow suit.
Definitely, and I think if Australia really want to play in the international market, which I know that they do, then that's where they're going to get the best benefit for actually engaging in these compliance programs early.
Yeah.
And I would say that also farmers are usually traditionally surprised that a lot of what they're doing is already in the compliance space, and that they're already ticking all of the things that they should be.
They just need to document it.
Yeah, they just don't know.
it.
And I think that to us is probably the biggest eye-opener, because we can go in and spend half an afternoon with a farmer or with a co-op and find that they actually have everything that they need. They're just not necessarily recording it that way.
And putting it into a systemised manner that can
Exactly.
be reflected and said, here you go, Saffron, this is what we're doing, and yes, we tick those boxes.
Yeah.
From the data that you might gain from the environmental side of things, if we have a look at that, is that on the increase? Is the environmental stuff just as equally as important in that whole ESG space for Agrana?
Definitely, and really, if we're not looking after our soil and looking after our water right now, we won't have the farm. So I think that has definitely become a big, and I would say that's probably beyond social, so it's environmental then social, just in a consumer's perception. I would say the reverse, but and I do think that consumers are driving that behaviour for the farmers as well. So really, they do have the practices and they do have the ability.
Yeah, no, that's good, because we certainly see that there's an increase in requirement for ESG reporting, and the data that is being requested now from growers to be able to supply up that supply chain and report on is only going to be more granular moving forward to be able to make those business decisions with as well.
I agree. But with that granular information will come an opportunity for them to improve their farms. And I think that's the positive outline of actually collecting the data.
That's right. What you measure, you can manage.
Yeah,
I think
exactly,
is what the
exactly.
saying
Well,
is.
I mean, it's such a big thing when you have a massive farm and you've got to understand exactly what's happening with every tree and every crop and every season, which is obviously coming fast and thick
Yeah.
in many parts of Australia. So it's good for them to have that as even just a measure for themselves, even if they didn't take it to compliance.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Well, Saffron Kosh, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you.
here today. Thank you for those of you who have joined us online here too. We look forward to you joining us for the next episode of Fair Talk, and thank you very much.